Yes, food is definitely something I'm passionate about and could potentially spend days talking about as well. I think in relation to Sri Lankan food, one thing, a place where I would like to quickly start is the effect that the Columbian exchange sort of had on Sri Lankan food. So Columbian exchange was the introduction of goods from the New World to the Old World. So New World was essentially like your Americas when the Portuguese and the Spanish went into Americas, they discovered quite a bit of what we would consider nowadays your staple household fruits and vegetables in those countries. So prior to the 1550s, if I'm not mistaken, 1500s, yeah, 1500s, then those things did not exist in Sri Lankan food or any food in the old world part of the world, right? So some of these were actually like your chili. Chili is such an integral part now in Sri Lankan cuisine, where you would add a chili to a curry, to your sambals and whatnot. We have potatoes and pumpkins and corn and cashews. The cashews were actually interesting because the cashews were brought on by the Portuguese from I think South America to Goa, and then from Goa it became to be known as kaju, and then from there we got cashews in Sri Lanka, which became kaju in Sri Lanka as well. So imagine all these fruits that and also in relation to fruits, I grew up on this idea that Sri Lanka has amazing tasting foods, and definitely they do, because everywhere else I've traveled in the world, if I have a papaya from a different country, it doesn't quite taste up to the standard of a Sri Lankan papaya that I grew up eating, or your pineapples or your jambus or any of those sorts of things. You don't quite get the same taste that you get in Sri Lanka in the rest of the world. But it was the Columbian exchange that brought all of these things to Sri Lanka and then to the rest of the Portuguese and Spanish colonies, and then eventually to the rest of the world as well. So even your Italian cuisine would not have had tomatoes before it was discovered in the Americas and brought over to Europe by the Portuguese and the Spanish. So when we look at cooking techniques in Sri Lanka, we can see that there's been lots of influence from different communities that have come onto the island. So temperado is actually a Portuguese word for tempering. And then this whole technique of tempering onions and garlic in spices is a very Portuguese thing. So when you travel to Portugal and you see this like dishes starting, the base becomes that, and that is also a very South Indian thing as well, like where you temper your spices to get all that flavor from them prior to adding your meats and your vegetables and stuff into it. So we can trace the origin of temperado back to other parts of the world where people have traveled to Sri Lanka from as well. And in terms of brining, the idea of vinegar was also something that the Portuguese brought to Goa and then to Sri Lanka as well. And they call it vinagre, if I'm not mistaken. And vinagre, yes.
Is the origin of the word?
Yeah, it is the origin of the word of vinegar as well. And in terms of baking, we once again go to the Portuguese because they did introduce the idea of bread making to lots of parts of the world. And you can trace that in the word pang, because when you travel to other parts of the world, like Japan or Hong Kong, where the Portuguese introduced bread there as well, you can trace back the same sort of word and the same sort of origin for that. And in terms of cakes, like love cakes, your Christmas cakes, and different sorts of things that especially the nuns at that time in Portugal were investing a lot of time in perfecting sweet meats. So all of your sweet foods like your cakes and your love cakes and Christmas cakes and your doses and stuff like that.
I'd just like to add to that by saying that there's a really lovely document called Culinary History of Portuguese Eurasians, which we read when doing research about the Portuguese cooking technique. And so a lot of Portuguese sweet making was preserved and refined by Portuguese nuns, who often lived inside the forts, the various forts like in Sri Lanka, and they would then refined these dessert making styles, which would then become part of common fare as the Portuguese mixed with everyone else. So even the word doce, like puhul doce, the origin goes back to Portugal. Doce means sweet, right? The Portuguese word is doce, just like the Portuguese word for vinegar is vinagre, which became vinagre in Sinhala. Kokis was a Dutch thing. And then, of course, things like dodol and muscat, though they weren't Portuguese, go back to sweet making cultures in other parts of the world. So muscat goes back to the ancient Middle East, and dodol comes to Sri Lanka from the ancient Malay communities of Sri Lanka. So the oldest references to dodol come from Indonesia and Malaysia. And over there, they have hundreds of varieties and flavors of dodol, whereas in Sri Lanka, we have the 2 or 3 varieties. And coincidentally, it is said in Sri Lanka, the best dodol comes from the south, Hambantota, which is a place with a large Malay community. And even the name Hambantota is a Malay word. It refers to the sampan tota. Sampan is a type of Malay sailing vessel. Carry on, Randika.
That's fine. So, when we get asked a question from our friends, like when I travel to Sri Lanka, what should I try? What are the most iconic Sri Lankan dishes? A list comes to our mind, which tends to often involve some of these, like, you should definitely try some kottu, hoppers, string hoppers, your potato curries, vada, drink a faluda. If you go in December, make sure to find a Christmas cake or an asmi or love cake or something like that. And what binds all of these iconic Lankan dishes together is the immigration into the island, because all of these were at some point or the other brought over to the island by someone else, by the communities that now call Sri Lanka their home, by the communities that we sort of discussed earlier. So without their contribution to Sri Lankan cuisine, we wouldn't have most of our iconic dishes. The list itself is almost too long to name, because if you start listing and identifying, how did Sri Lanka actually get this dish? You actually in my mind, you start running out of things that could have potentially started their origins on the island of Sri Lanka, with the exception of your native indigenous cuisines that involve a lot of finger millet and stuff like that. And yeah.
Yes, so on the topic of really native, absolutely indigenous Sri Lankan food, really, just like in Australia, the oldest food in Sri Lanka is the food of the indigenous people. There's a lovely book written called Vadi Sampradana Ahara, which has been endorsed by the indigenous community, written recently, not recently, a few years ago by this lady in Sri Lanka, a researcher. And really, the only food we can absolutely certainly say Sri Lankan is the indigenous food. And that is stuff like there's various roots and tubers. There are various tree barks that are processed into chewing materials, like the Opuleru kampoja, which is an indigenous word. It's a type of beetle, chewing beetle, I should say. And of course, things like the tail of the Talagoya, the parenti type, the lizard, the monitor lizard in Sri Lanka. The tail is very popularly eaten in Sri Lanka. Various game meats, that's another thing that's very popular in Sri Lanka. Although Sri Lankans don't often eat meat, many Sri Lankans do eat game meat, so wild boar and things like that, and you can find that stuff commonly eaten in Sri Lanka. Wild deer, these and finger millet, kurahan, and honey preservation is another thing. Our indigenous communities preserve meat in honey, very unique in the world, where they submerge the meat in honey and then dry it out and smoke it, which makes it last for a long time. Now, these are possibly the oldest and most Sri Lankan dishes, even though many of us haven't eaten these things and may not have encountered them. These are the most how can I say, certifiably Sri Lankan dishes. And everything else, it seems, based on our research, came from somewhere else. In case you're wondering about this list, faluda comes from ancient Persia, where they still drink faluda. Same with sarwat, the Christmas cake, and love cake comes from Portugal and the Portuguese colonies. Kokis, kaum, all these things go to somewhere else. The sambals come to us from Indonesia. And of course, even like venerated things like the kottu and the hoppers eventually find their way to historical southern India. And you'll find these foods in other places where these communities have settled as well. So you will find things like Pittu in Malaysia and Singapore, where there are large South Indian communities, and so on. So I just thought I'd add that to our little discussion about.
I think what's important to remember is that with every new community came a new dish and new cooking techniques as well, to use with our existing ingredients and the ingredients that sort of came onto the island with these people as well. So often these dishes and techniques mixed with the existing culinary scene of Sri Lanka at the time to create many of these iconic dishes and make them truly Lankan. So the way like we would eat a pittu might be different from the community that eats pittu in, let's say, South India, or even in places like Malaysia and Singapore, where you do have a South Indian community. So it's important to know that the current culinary landscape of Sri Lanka would not have been this way if it wasn't for the people who brought their dishes and introduced those dishes to Sri Lanka, right? So if it wasn't for them, the whole scene would be completely different, and multicultural history has a lot to contribute to the Sri Lankan culinary scene. So an important thing to remember is that as we eat and we share our cuisine with others, especially in Australia with our friends and family and whatnot, we should always take a moment to sort of appreciate the journey that these dishes have had to make to end up on our plates, you know? So something needed to have come from Persia or Portugal or even the Americas to make it to a Lankan rice and curry plate or our Lankan buffet. So it's important to understand that and also to sort of appreciate it and give it credit where it's sort of due. So what's important here is that the whole discussion is that, you know, Sri Lanka is extremely diverse. Its diversity is shown in our food, in the way we speak our languages, how we dress, how we interact with people, the religions we practice, and everything that sort of makes Sri Lanka truly Sri Lankan.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that, a lot of us have grown up on the idea that, Sri Lanka has three ethnic groups, Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslim, and it's far more complex and rich than that. And, I do feel like even though a lot of us have grown up in a way that has taught us to almost discount the value of multiculturalism, or to somehow imagine that it's just not a relevant thing to us, it's actually important to realize that it is relevant and it really is a strength to Sri Lanka. There are many countries in the world which have communities, right? Lots of communities. Australia is multicultural in one way because it has lots of different people from around the world. But Australia is not mixed, for example, in the way that we are in Sri Lanka. People haven't mixed in their language. We largely speak English here. Whereas in Sri Lanka, we speak so many languages. We have a deep, integrated multiculturalism that goes beyond a large number of people living in one place. We've actually mixed and integrated genetically, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, musically, and in terms of our food. And that's a really special, rare thing that takes millennia to happen. One day, places like Australia will probably be like Sri Lanka, where people have mixed to the point where we lose track of individual threads of multiculturalism. But it's really important to remember that multiculturalism is a strength of Sri Lanka, and I hope that our little presentation has helped you see that it is an important thing, and that it is actually part of us, and part of the nature of being Sri Lankan. So this is a lovely quote that Randika really likes. Strength lies in differences, not in similarities. And both Randika and I have been making a few videos. Our YouTube channel is called Mataya Project. And we also have a Facebook page where we make videos about Sri Lanka's history and Sri Lankan multiculturalism, and also issues of mental health and other issues in Sri Lanka. Our latest video is on the coffee history of Sri Lanka. And that concludes our presentation, Randika. Anything else you have to say?
No, thank you so much for listening to us. I know it was difficult with the technical difficulties dropping in and out. So apologies for that. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask now, send them to us later, or if you want any clarifications, feel free to reach out.
And as we would say in the indigenous language of Sri Lanka, mama kachak hondamai.